A hidden world beneath success. Charles Benson sat in his sleek, minimalist office, staring at the massive glass windows overlooking the bustling city below. At 48 years old, he was at the pinnacle of his career. As the CEO of Benson Enterprises, a multimillion-dollar tech company that had pioneered groundbreaking advancements in artificial intelligence and automation, Charles had earned his place among the corporate elite. His journey from a small, working-class neighborhood to the top echelons of Silicon Valley had been long, but he never forgot where he came from. Today, however, something felt off. The numbers were great: record-breaking revenue, successful product launches, and a workforce of over 1,500 employees. Yet despite the accolades, awards, and wealth, Charles couldn't shake the growing sense of unease gnawing at him. His assistant, Olivia, knocked softly on the door, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Mr. Benson, HR has the employee satisfaction survey results you requested," she said, placing a file on his desk. Charles smiled at her, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, Olivia. I'll look them over." When the door closed behind her, he opened the file, expecting more or less the same data he had seen in the past. A few minor complaints, the usual grumblings, but nothing serious. Yet, as he read through the pages, his heart sank. The numbers were startling. Employee satisfaction had plummeted by 20% in just 6 months. More troubling were the open-ended comments. "Management doesn't care. I feel invisible here. There's favoritism. We're overworked and undervalued." Charles leaned back in his chair, stunned. How could this be happening? He prided himself on creating a company where employees thrived, where innovation was rewarded, and where everyone felt like part of a family. But it seemed like that vision had been compromised, lost amidst the rapid growth and layers of management. The thought plagued him for days. His top executives, brilliant minds with Ivy League degrees and years of experience, had dismissed the survey results as part of the growing pains of a rapidly expanding company. But Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, something hidden in the daily grind of his employees' lives that the surveys couldn't capture. Then an idea hit him. It was bold, unconventional, and some might even call it crazy, but it felt right. If he wanted to understand what was truly happening, he couldn't do it from behind a desk. He needed to be in the trenches, to see the company from the ground up. He needed to become one of them. That evening, Charles sat down with his wife, Camille, over dinner. He had been married to her for nearly 2 decades, and she was his closest confidant, always ready to offer her wisdom and guidance. "There's something I've been thinking about," he began, swirling his glass of wine thoughtfully. "And I need your support." Camille raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it, Charles?" "I'm going undercover. As a janitor. At the company." Camille blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "A janitor." He nodded. "I need to know what's really going on with our employees, how they're being treated, how they feel about working there. And I can't do that as the CEO. No one's going to be honest with me while I'm sitting in the corner office. But if I'm just a regular guy cleaning floors, I'll see the truth." Camille stared at him for a moment, then smiled, a warm, supportive smile that made him remember why he had fallen in love with her. "That's crazy," she said, laughing softly. "But it's exactly the kind of crazy thing you would do. I think it's brilliant." Charles felt a weight lift off his shoulders. If Camille believed in the idea, he knew he could pull it off. "I'll start next week. I've already spoken to HR. They're going to bring me in through one of the janitorial agencies we contract. No one will know." A week later, Charles found himself standing in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. He barely recognized himself. Gone was the clean-cut, polished CEO image. In its place was a man with a scruffy beard, thick-rimmed glasses, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His custom-tailored suits had been replaced with faded, ill-fitting janitorial coveralls. It was perfect. As he drove to work that morning, taking a route unfamiliar to him, He couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement mixed with anxiety. For the first time in years, no one would know his name or treat him like he was someone special. He parked his car at the far end of the lot, away from the executive parking spaces, and walked into the building like any other employee. At the entrance, the security guard barely looked up as he checked Charles' ID badge, a temporary one issued for Charlie, his new identity. "Janitorial services are in the basement," the guard muttered, waving him through. Charles made his way down to the lower levels, where he met Doris, the head of the janitorial staff. A no-nonsense woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her hair and a permanent scowl. "You must be the new guy," Doris said, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. "Don't get in my way, and we'll get along fine." "Got it. Got it," Charles replied, trying to match her gruff tone. For the rest of the morning, Doris showed him the ropes, how to mop the floors, clean the restrooms, take out the trash, and maintain the building's common areas. It was grueling physical work Charles hadn't done since he was a teenager. But he didn't mind. This was exactly what he had come here to experience. The real test came when Doris sent him out to clean the executive wing, where Charles himself usually worked. As he pushed the mop bucket into the pristine halls, he felt an odd sense of displacement. This was his domain, yet now he was an outsider, someone invisible, someone who blended into the background. He overheard conversations he wasn't supposed to hear, executives complaining about deadlines, talking dismissively about lower-level employees, even cracking jokes about how little they had to do to keep the machine running. It stung. But what hit Charles hardest was the way he was treated. People passed him by without a glance, without acknowledging his presence. He was just the janitor, someone to clean up after them, not someone to talk to. It was a humbling experience, and it made him realize just how out of touch he had become with the realities of his own company. As he mopped the floors outside a conference room, he caught snippets of a conversation between two mid-level managers. They were discussing the results of the latest project, and one of them made a disparaging remark about how the people at the bottom just don't get it. Charles clenched the mop handle tighter. This was the culture he had built. At the end of his first day, Charles felt exhausted, not just from the physical labor, but from the emotional toll of seeing his company in a way he never had before. As he walked back to his car, he realized that this undercover journey was going to reveal far more than he had ever anticipated. The real work was just beginning. Cracks beneath the surface. The second day of Charles Benson's undercover journey began just as the first had ended, humbling. As he slipped into his janitor's uniform, complete with worn-out boots and the thick glasses that were part of his disguise, Charles felt a growing sense of discomfort. It wasn't the physical work that bothered him, nor was it the loss of status he experienced in his temporary role. It was the isolation. In his first day on the job, Charles realized that people weren't just ignoring him. They didn't see him at all. As he walked into the building that morning, Charles was met with the familiar sounds of keyboards clattering and phones ringing, but now it felt different. He wasn't an executive passing by on his way to an important meeting. He was the janitor who cleaned up after those meetings, and it was in those unnoticed spaces that Charles began to see the real heart of his company, flaws and all. Doris, his supervisor, greeted him with a curt nod. "Morning, Charlie," she said, handing him his cleaning supplies. "You're on restroom duty today. Lucky you." Charles forced a smile. Lucky, indeed. As he pushed his cart toward the nearest restroom, he couldn't help but reflect on how alien the day-to-day reality of his employees had become to him. Before, his mornings had been spent reviewing strategy, meeting with high-level executives, and negotiating partnerships. Now he was scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins. The contrast was stark, but it was exactly what he had come here to experience. Inside the first restroom, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow on the tiled floors. As he scrubbed the sinks and mirrors, Charles overheard a conversation between two young employees who had walked in, oblivious to his presence. "I don't know how much longer I can take this," one of them said, his voice tense with frustration. "I'm drowning in work, and no one even notices. It's like they just pile it on and forget about us." The other employee, a woman with a tired expression, sighed. "Tell me about it. I've been here 2 years, and I'm still stuck in the same position. Every time I ask for a promotion, it's the same excuse. We're not ready to move you up yet. I'm starting to wonder if it'll ever happen." Charles paused, his hand still gripping the cleaning rag. He had never heard this level of dissatisfaction before. On paper, the company's turnover rate was low, and they offered competitive salaries. But it seemed that beneath the surface, many employees felt trapped, undervalued, and ignored. He finished cleaning the restroom in silence, his mind racing. As the day progressed, Charles found himself in the company's sprawling open office, cleaning the glass partitions between desks and wiping down the conference rooms. It was a strange feeling, being so close to the inner workings of the company he had built, yet so distant from the decisions being made. He overheard project updates, marketing strategies, and development timelines, but it all felt like noise compared to the whispers of discontent he had been hearing from the lower-level employees. In the afternoon, Charles was tasked with cleaning the executive suite, the very same suite where he had spent years making decisions that shaped the future of the company. As he approached the familiar glass doors, he felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with discomfort. It was surreal to be on the other side of the equation. Inside, the suite was as pristine as ever, the polished wood floors gleaming under the soft lighting. Charles pushed his mop bucket into the hallway and began cleaning, careful to avoid eye contact with anyone who might recognize him. He felt like an intruder in a world that had once been his. As he wiped down the conference table, he overheard a meeting in progress through the partially open door of the CEO's office, the office that was still technically his, though he hadn't set foot in it since going undercover. 2 of his senior executives were discussing a recent client project, and their conversation quickly turned to the employees involved. "I don't know what's going on with these teams lately," one of the executives said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They're behind on deadlines, and I keep hearing complaints about morale. It's like no one wants to put in the effort anymore." The other executive laughed bitterly. "Morale? Come on, we're not running a daycare. They get paid well, don't they? If they can't handle the pressure, they can go find a job somewhere else." Charles clenched his jaw as he listened. Was this really how his leadership team viewed their employees? He had always believed in building a company that valued its workforce, a place where people could grow and thrive. But the attitude he was hearing now was one of callousness and detachment, traits he had fought to eliminate from the company's culture. When the meeting ended and the executives left, Charles was left standing alone in the executive suite, his mop in hand. The silence was deafening. He realized that his leadership team didn't just fail to see the struggles of their employees, they actively dismissed them. That evening, Charles sat in his living room, staring blankly at the TV as Camille worked on her laptop beside him. He hadn't told her everything he had learned yet, but the weight of it pressed down on him. "How was your day?" Camille asked, glancing over at him. Charles sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Eye-opening, to say the least." Camille set her laptop aside and gave him her full attention. "Do you want to talk about it?" For a moment, Charles considered holding back, but then the words spilled out. He told her about the dissatisfaction he had overheard, the dismissive comments from the executives, and the feeling of invisibility that seemed to pervade the lower levels of the company. "It's worse than I thought," he admitted. "I knew there were issues with morale, but I didn't realize how deep it went. People feel stuck, overlooked, and undervalued. And my executives, they don't seem to care." Camille listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like the company has lost its way," she said gently. "But now that you know, you have a chance to change it." Charles nodded slowly. "Yeah, but where do I even start? The culture's so ingrained. It's not something I can fix with a memo or a team-building exercise. Maybe not, Camille said, but you can lead by example. You've always been someone who cares about people. If you show your employees that you're listening, that you see them, that could be the first step. Her words resonated with him. He had built Benson Enterprises from the ground up with the belief that people were the most important asset a company had. Somewhere along the way, that message had been lost, but it wasn't too late to reclaim it. The next morning, Charles was back at work, scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins, but this time his ears were open in a different way. He wasn't just listening for complaints or grumblings. He was listening for the stories of the people who worked for him, their hopes, their frustrations, their dreams. In the break room, he overheard a conversation between two junior employees. One of them, a young woman with curly hair and glasses, was talking about a project she had been working on. "I put my heart and soul into that presentation," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "But when I showed it to my supervisor, he barely looked at it. He just handed it off to someone else and said they'd take it from here. I don't know why I bother." Her friend, a tall man with a weary expression, nodded sympathetically. "It's the same for me. No matter how hard I work, it feels like I'm just spinning my wheels. They don't see us, you know. We're just cogs in the machine." Charles felt a familiar pang of guilt. He had always believed that Benson Enterprises was a place where people could grow and succeed, but the reality was far different. His employees didn't feel valued. They felt invisible. As he finished his shift that day, Charles knew that his undercover journey was far from over. There were still more layers to uncover, more truths to confront. But one thing was clear: if he wanted to save his company, he would need to change not just the policies, but the very soul of the organization. And that change would have to start with him. The weight of silence. The dim fluorescent lights of the janitorial office buzzed overhead as Charles Benson, now Charlie the janitor, stood before Doris, the no-nonsense supervisor who ruled the basement of Benson Enterprises with an iron fist. Her stern face softened only slightly as she handed him his mop and bucket, gesturing toward the pile of cleaning supplies that would be his tools for the day. "You got the lobby floors today, Charlie," Doris said, eyeing him with the same suspicious look she'd given him the day before. "Make sure it shines. You don't want people walking in and thinking we don't take care of the place." Charles gave her a nod, trying to maintain the easygoing, unassuming demeanor he had adopted for his role. Inside, though, his mind was racing. The first day had been eye-opening, but it was clear that there was much more to uncover. His employees weren't just invisible to upper management. They were invisible to each other. As he made his way to the lobby, pushing his cart through the maze of hallways, Charles reflected on what he had heard the previous day. Employees complaining about being overworked, conversations where people joked about their colleagues as if they were obstacles to success. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper problem. Something was off, and he needed to understand the full picture if he was going to make real changes. The lobby of Benson Enterprises was as grand as ever, a wide, marble-floored entrance that gleamed in the early morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a space designed to impress clients and visitors, a symbol of the company's success and sophistication. But today, as Charles dipped his mop into the soapy water and began to clean, the grandeur felt hollow. As he worked, employees streamed in, hurrying to their desks with coffee cups in hand, eyes glued to their phones or focused on their conversations. Charles noticed something strange. No one looked at him. Not one person acknowledged his presence, not even with a nod or a smile. It was as if he were part of the background, as invisible as the plants or the furniture. Halfway through mopping the expansive floors, Charles overheard a conversation between two women who had paused by the front desk. They were talking about a colleague, someone from marketing. "Can you believe how much work she dumps on us?" one of them said, shaking her head. "I swear she just takes credit for everything while we do all the heavy lifting." The other woman sighed. "I know. I've been trying to get out of her department for months, but no one's hiring internally. It's like we're stuck in a hamster wheel. No promotions, no movement. Charles pretended to focus on his work, but every word hit him like a punch to the gut. He had believed that his company was a place where talent was rewarded, where hard work paid off. But these conversations were painting a very different picture, one where employees felt trapped and unseen, even by their peers. It wasn't just the silence between management and the workforce, it was the silence between the employees themselves. They didn't see each other, and they certainly didn't see him. Later that day, Charles found himself assigned to clean the upper-level executive suites. This time, as he entered the world he had once ruled, it felt different. He was no longer the CEO walking through the halls, greeting his senior team members with a confident handshake. He was the janitor now, someone who slipped in and out of rooms unnoticed. As he worked his way through the office floors, polishing the glass walls and dusting the desks, he overheard fragments of conversations that unsettled him. In one conference room, two senior managers were discussing the results of a recent project review. "I don't care how late they have to stay. We need those numbers by tomorrow," one of them said, her voice clipped. "And if they can't deliver, we'll find someone who can." The other manager chuckled, a sound that made Charles's stomach churn. "Yeah, it's not like we're asking them to cure cancer. They should be grateful to even have a job here." Charles bit his tongue, his jaw tightening as he continued scrubbing the floor. Grateful. These people thought their employees should be grateful just to have a job, despite working long hours with little recognition. It was exactly the kind of toxic mentality he had feared when he first saw the results of the employee satisfaction survey. He made his way toward his old office, the large corner suite that had been his home away from home for years. He had instructed Olivia, his assistant, to keep it locked during his absence, but as he approached, he noticed the door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of him, and he gently pushed it open. Inside, his desk was as pristine as ever, untouched since he had begun his undercover operation. The sight of it, the polished wood, the view of the city skyline, sent a pang of longing through him. He missed the comfort of that office, the authority it represented. But at the same time, he knew that this undercover mission was more important than any of that. As he turned to leave, he heard voices coming from the hallway. It was two of his top executives, Thomas and Carla. He froze, not wanting them to see him. They stopped just outside his office, and their conversation drifted inside. "I don't know why Charles is so worried about these survey results," Thomas said, his voice dismissive. "So what if a few people are unhappy? It's a company. People are always going to complain." Carla laughed softly. "Exactly. Besides, we're still making money hand over fist. As long as the profits are rolling in, who cares if morale is a little low? They'll get over it." Charles stood there, his heart sinking. This was his leadership team. The people he had trusted to carry forward his vision for Benson Enterprises. And they didn't care. They didn't care about the people working late into the night, or the employees who felt overworked and underappreciated. All they cared about was the bottom line. He had built this company to be different, to be a place where people were valued. But somewhere along the way, that vision had been lost, and now even his most trusted leaders had become blind to the very foundation of their success, the employees. When Charles returned home that evening, he was unusually quiet. Camille, his wife, noticed right away. "Rough day?" she asked gently, setting aside the book she had been reading. Charles nodded, sinking into the chair across from her. "It's worse than I thought," he admitted. "The employees are unhappy, frustrated. They feel like no one sees them. And the worst part is, they're right." Camille frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I overheard my own executives today talking about how the employees should be grateful just to have a job. They don't care about morale or the stress people are under. All they care about is the bottom line. And I let this happen." Camille reached out and took his hand. "You didn't let this happen, Charles. You built something incredible. But maybe with all the growth, things slipped through the cracks. You can still fix this." Charles sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "But how? It's not like I can just walk in and tell people to be nicer. The culture's already rotten. Changing that, it's not going to be easy." "You don't have to do it all at once," Camille said softly. "Start small. Listen to people. Show them that you care. If they see you leading by example, the culture will start to change." Charles nodded slowly, knowing she was right. But that didn't make it any less daunting. He had seen how deep the problems ran, and he knew that fixing them would take more than just a few speeches or policy changes. It would take real, meaningful action. The next morning, Charles returned to work, his mind buzzing with thoughts of how to tackle the massive challenge ahead. But for now, he still had to finish his undercover mission. He spent the day moving through the different departments, cleaning, listening, observing. In the break room, he noticed a group of younger employees sitting together, their conversation hushed but intense. One of them, a man with glasses and a nervous energy, was speaking in a low voice. "I tried to bring up the project delays to my manager," he said, shaking his head. "But she just brushed me off. Said it wasn't my place to question the timeline. Now we're behind, and she's blaming the whole team." The others nodded in sympathy, their frustration palpable. "It's the same in my department," a woman added. "No one takes responsibility. They just push the blame down the chain." Charles felt a familiar surge of anger. These were talented people, passionate about their work, and they were being crushed under the weight of poor leadership. He knew that if he didn't step in soon, the company's culture would continue to deteriorate, taking its brightest minds down with it. As he finished his shift, Charles knew that his next steps would be crucial. He had learned a lot in his short time as Charlie, but the most important lesson was this: his company was broken, and it was up to him to fix it. But the path to redemption wouldn't be easy. It would require him to confront hard truths, not just about his employees, but about himself and the decisions he had made along the way. The silence that had once surrounded him as CEO was now deafening, and he knew that if he wanted to save his company, he would need to break that silence, starting with the people who needed to be heard the most. Unmasking the truth. Charles Benson stood in front of the full-length mirror in his modest break-room locker, adjusting his janitor's uniform for the third time that morning. The unfamiliar outfit, with its frayed collar and worn fabric, felt strange on his skin, a far cry from the tailored suits and crisp shirts he was used to. But this was his reality now, and the longer he stayed in disguise, the more distant his old life as CEO seemed. He no longer felt like the powerful executive at the helm of Benson Enterprises. He felt like Charlie, the janitor, an invisible worker, part of the unnoticed machinery of the company. It was a jarring transformation, but Charles had begun to embrace it. He needed to remain in the shadows to see the truth, to understand what his employees really experienced. The truths he had already uncovered about the toxic culture, the burnout, the rampant favoritism, still weighed heavily on him. But he knew there was more, deeper issues festering beneath the surface, hidden by the polite facade the company presented to the world. As he grabbed his cleaning supplies for the day and headed out into the heart of the building, he found himself assigned to one of the most critical areas of the office, the Research and Development, R&D department. This was where the magic happened, the department responsible for all of Benson Enterprises' cutting-edge innovations. The future of the company was being built here, and Charles had high hopes that, if any part of the company was still intact, it would be R&D. But as he entered the R&D floor, pushing his cart quietly down the hall, he realized almost immediately that his optimism was misplaced. The first thing Charles noticed was the tension. Unlike other departments where employees buzzed about in a hurried but relatively harmonious way, the atmosphere in R&D was stifling. He could feel the pressure radiating off the employees as they sat hunched over their computers, their eyes bloodshot from hours spent staring at screens. The collaborative energy that should have filled the space, the brainstorming, the excited chatter about new ideas, was absent. Instead, silence dominated, broken only by the occasional frustrated sigh or the rapid clacking of keys. Charles made his way down the aisle, cleaning desks and wiping down surfaces, careful to remain unobtrusive. He noticed a small group gathered around a table in the corner, discussing a project with hushed voices. He couldn't help but eavesdrop. "I'm telling you, the timeline they've set for this is impossible," one of the engineers, a young man in his late 20s, said, rubbing his temples. "We need at least 2 more months to get the prototype ready. If we rush it, it's going to be a disaster." Another engineer, a woman with dark circles under her eyes, nodded in agreement. "I've already brought this up with management. They don't care. They just want results, and they don't care how we get there. I've been pulling 14-hour days just to keep up, and it's not enough." Charles frowned, his hands pausing on the desk he was cleaning. This was not what he had envisioned for R&D. These were supposed to be the brightest minds in the company, the innovators who pushed boundaries and explored new horizons. But instead of feeling inspired, they were being crushed by unrealistic expectations and impossible deadlines. He pushed his cart farther down the hall, his heart heavy. He had built Benson Enterprises to be a place of innovation, where talent was nurtured and creativity flourished. But what he was seeing now was the exact opposite. People being driven to the brink of exhaustion, their potential wasted in a culture that prioritized output over ingenuity. As the morning wore on, Charles found himself in the R&D break room, wiping down the counters and sweeping the floors. It was a small, windowless space, far less glamorous than the executive lounge he used to frequent. 2 engineers were sitting at a nearby table, their voices low, but the frustration in their tones unmistakable. "You heard about Allison, right?" one of them asked, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one else could hear. The other engineer nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yeah, poor thing. She was one of the best in the department. Now she's gone. Burnt out." Charles' ears perked up, and he slowed his movements, straining to hear more. "She gave everything to this place," the first engineer continued. "Worked weekends, stayed late, took on extra projects. But when she asked for time off after her father passed away, they gave her hell for it. Said it wasn't a good time for her to take leave. Can you believe that?" The other engineer shook his head, disgusted. "Unbelievable. And now they're acting like it's her fault for not managing her stress. It's not just her, though. I know at least 3 other people who've left for the same reason. They're burning us out and then blaming us for not being able to keep up." Charles felt a knot form in his stomach. This was worse than he had imagined. He had seen the warning signs, the long hours, the growing dissatisfaction. But he hadn't realized how deep the damage went. People were being pushed past their breaking points, their personal lives disregarded in favor of the company's relentless pursuit of profit. As he finished cleaning the break room, Charles' mind raced. He had known that the company's culture had shifted as it grew, but he hadn't realized just how far it had fallen. His executives had lost sight of the company's values, and in their drive to meet quarterly targets, they had sacrificed the well-being of the very people who made those achievements possible. But it wasn't just the executives who were at fault. Charles had allowed this to happen. He had been so focused on the company's growth, on expanding into new markets and developing new products, that he had lost touch with the people who had helped him get there. He had trusted his leadership team to carry out his vision, but they had strayed from the path, and he had been too distant to notice. That afternoon, as Charles continued his rounds through the R&D department, he found himself face to face with one of the most brilliant minds in the company, Dr. Olivia Morgan, the head of the R&D division. She was a renowned engineer with a reputation for pushing the boundaries of AI technology, and Charles had always admired her work from afar. But now, standing in the hallway outside her office, He could see the toll the job had taken on her. Olivia's once sharp, vibrant energy had dimmed. Her usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her eyes lined with exhaustion. She was in the middle of a heated phone call, her voice tense and strained. "I understand the deadline, but we need more resources," she was saying, pacing back and forth. "I can't keep asking my team to pull double shifts. They're burnt out, and if we don't get this right, the whole project could collapse." Charles lingered nearby, pretending to clean as he listened to her frustration. Olivia was fighting to keep the department afloat, but she was being met with resistance from the higher-ups. He felt a pang of guilt. He had put Olivia in this position, given her more responsibility than anyone else in the company, without providing her with the support she needed. Now she was drowning under the weight of it all. As Olivia ended the call, she let out a deep sigh, leaning against the wall as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. Charles wanted to say something, to reassure her that help was coming, but he knew he couldn't break character. Not yet. That evening, after his shift had ended, Charles drove home in silence. The roads were quiet, but his mind was anything but. The conversations he had overheard, the exhaustion he had witnessed, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Benson Enterprises had lost its way. The company that had once been a beacon of innovation and employee empowerment was now a place where people felt overworked, undervalued, and forgotten. As he pulled into the driveway of his home, he found Camille waiting for him on the porch, her face soft with concern. "How was today?" she asked, as he climbed the steps and sat beside her. Charles shook his head, letting out a long breath. "Worse than I thought," he admitted. "People are burning out. They're frustrated, exhausted, and they feel like no one cares." Camille frowned, her hand resting gently on his arm. "And what are you going to do about it?" Charles stared out into the fading sunset, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I need to make changes, real changes." Camille nodded, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You always knew this wasn't going to be easy, Charles, but you're not alone. You've built something incredible, and you can rebuild it, but it's going to take time, and you're going to need help." Charles knew she was right. He couldn't fix the company on his own. But before he could even begin to address the problems, he needed to confront the people responsible, the executives who had allowed this toxic culture to thrive. It wouldn't be an easy conversation, but it was one he could no longer avoid. The time for observing was over. It was time to take action. The confrontation. The next morning, Charles Benson sat in his car outside Benson Enterprises, the engine still running, his mind racing. It had been a week since he first put on the janitor's uniform and entered his company undercover, and in that time, he had uncovered enough to last a lifetime. His heart pounded as he stared at the sleek building in front of him, a symbol of everything he had built and everything that had gone wrong. Today was the day he would stop watching from the sidelines. Today was the day of reckoning. The conversations he had overheard, the exhaustion etched on his employees' faces, the toxic culture festering behind closed doors, all of it weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just the managers and executives who were complicit in creating this environment. He had played a role too, through his distance and inattention. But now, there was no more room for hesitation. He cut the engine and stepped out of the car, no longer wearing the worn janitor's uniform. Today, he was the CEO again, and he had a job to do. As Charles entered the building, a few employees greeted him with nods and smiles, their faces filled with admiration and awe. His presence usually commanded respect, but today it felt different. He didn't want their reverence. He wanted their trust, and that, he knew, would take time to rebuild. His first stop was the executive conference room on the top floor, where a weekly leadership meeting was about to take place. He walked past the glass walls of the office floors, observing his managers and senior leaders moving through their routines. To the outside observer, everything seemed perfect. The office hummed with productivity, and the high-end design of the workspace gave off an air of success. But Charles knew that beneath this polished exterior, his company was rotting from the inside out. When he entered the conference room, the top executives were already seated around the table. Marcus, his COO, with his ever-present smirk. Jessica, the head of HR, flipping through her tablet. Linda, the operations lead, her fingers drumming impatiently on the table. They all turned as he walked in, surprised by his sudden appearance. It wasn't often that Charles attended these meetings in person, especially without notice. "Charles," Marcus said, his tone warm but puzzled. "We didn't expect you today. Is everything okay?" Charles closed the door behind him and took a seat at the head of the table, locking eyes with each of his senior team members in turn. He could feel the tension in the room rising, the subtle shift in their posture as they realized something was different. "Everything is not okay," Charles said, his voice steady but firm. "In fact, things are far worse than I ever imagined." A ripple of discomfort passed through the group. Jessica glanced at Marcus, her brow furrowed. Linda stopped drumming her fingers and leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "What do you mean?" Jessica asked cautiously. "We've had some bumps recently, sure, but the numbers are still strong. We just had our best quarter." Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. "I'm not talking about the numbers. I'm talking about our people. The employees who are keeping this company running while we sit in this room and congratulate ourselves on hitting our targets. Do you know how they feel? Have any of you actually talked to them?" Silence fell over the room. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Linda raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I have," Charles continued, his voice rising slightly. "I've spent the last week talking to them, listening to their frustrations, seeing firsthand how they're treated. And let me tell you, the picture you all have been painting for me over the past few months, it's a lie." Marcus frowned, finally finding his voice. "Charles, what are you talking about? I don't understand." Charles took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to reveal would send shockwaves through the room. "I've been working here undercover. For the past week, I've been posing as a janitor, walking the halls, cleaning the floors, hearing conversations I never would have heard otherwise. And what I've learned is that this company, the one I've spent my life building, has become a place where people are scared to speak up. They're overworked, undervalued, and burned out. We've created a culture of fear and resentment, and we're losing some of our best people because of it." The room erupted into a flurry of confused murmurs. Marcus stared at him, dumbfounded, while Jessica looked genuinely shocked. Linda leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "You've been undercover?" Marcus asked, his voice full of disbelief. "As a janitor?" Charles nodded. "Yes, and I've seen things you wouldn't believe. People in R&D are on the verge of collapse because of unrealistic deadlines. Engineers are leaving because they feel their ideas aren't being heard. The management team is dismissing the concerns of the very people who are keeping this company afloat. And what's worse, some of you have been complicit in this." Linda uncrossed her arms, her voice cold. "Are you accusing us of mistreating the employees, Charles?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Charles replied, locking eyes with her. "I'm stating facts. Our culture is broken, and it didn't happen overnight. We've been so focused on profits, growth, and staying ahead of the competition that we've forgotten about the people who make that success possible, and we are all responsible for that." Jessica cleared her throat, her voice more tentative than usual. "I'm sorry, Charles, but I had no idea things were this bad. If I had known." "You didn't know because you weren't looking," Charles interrupted, his tone harsh but not unkind. "None of us were. We were too busy looking at the bottom line to notice the cracks forming beneath us." Marcus, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "Okay, I hear you, Charles. But what exactly are you proposing? You can't expect us to fix a problem this big overnight. Culture doesn't change with a snap of the fingers. I'm not asking for an overnight fix, Charles said, his voice firm. But we need to start somewhere. I'm going to begin by making it clear to the entire company that we're not going to tolerate this toxic culture anymore. That starts with us, here, in this room. Linda raised an eyebrow. What does that mean, exactly? It means transparency, Charles replied. It means giving employees a real voice, and not just through some anonymous survey. It means holding managers accountable for their actions, and it means rewarding people for more than just their output. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze steady and uncompromising. And it means that anyone who isn't on board with this change needs to rethink their place here. The tension in the room was thick as Charles outlined his plan. He would begin with a company-wide town hall, addressing the issues head-on and inviting employees to share their concerns openly. He would set up a task force to overhaul the company's policies on work-life balance, promotion, and employee recognition, and he would personally oversee the changes in the leadership structure, making sure that every department head understood the new direction the company was taking. It was an ambitious plan, and he knew it would meet resistance, but Charles had seen enough during his time undercover to know that drastic changes were necessary. He couldn't allow his company to continue down this path of neglect and disillusionment. As he finished outlining his vision, the room was silent. His executives were processing what he had just said, the enormity of it sinking in. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice softer than usual. Charles, I didn't know things had gotten this bad. But if this is what you want, then I'm with you. We can make this right. Jessica nodded in agreement, though her expression was still one of shock. We'll support you, Charles. Whatever it takes. Linda, however, remained silent for a moment longer, her face unreadable. Then she leaned back in her chair, her eyes locking with Charles. If we're going to do this, we need to be prepared for the fallout. Some people aren't going to like it. We could lose talent. We could lose clients. Charles didn't flinch. We might. But if we don't change, we'll lose a lot more. We'll lose the very soul of this company. And that's a price I'm not willing to pay. Linda finally nodded, though it was clear she was still skeptical. All right then. Let's see what happens. That evening, after the meeting had ended and the executives had left, Charles sat alone in his office, staring out at the city lights. The weight of what he had done settled over him, but so did a sense of relief. For the first time in months, he felt like he was back in control, not of the company's profits, but of its future. There was still a long road ahead. The changes he was implementing would be met with resistance, and some people might leave. But Charles knew that if he didn't act now, Benson Enterprises would crumble under the weight of its own success. Tomorrow would be the start of something new, something better. Seeds of change. Charles Benson sat in his office, the same sleek corner room he had occupied for years, but for the first time, it felt like a completely different space. The view of the city skyline was the same. The polished mahogany desk still gleamed under the soft lighting, and the hum of activity outside his door continued as always. Yet something had shifted, deep within the heart of the company and within him. He had just finished drafting the email that would announce the first of many sweeping changes to Benson Enterprises. It would be sent to every single employee, from the highest-ranking executive to the janitors who worked the late shifts. This wasn't going to be just another corporate memo. It was a declaration of intent, a signal that things were about to change in a big way. The email was simple but powerful. To all employees of Benson Enterprises, in recent months, I have come to realize that we, as a company, have drifted away from the values that built us. Many of you have felt unseen, unheard, and overworked. That ends now. I take full responsibility for not addressing these issues sooner, and I am committed to leading us through a period of transformation. Starting today, I am implementing changes that will restore balance, transparency, and respect to our workplace. You will hear more about these changes in the coming days, but I want you to know that your voice matters, and we are going to build a culture where everyone is valued. I will be hosting a live town hall tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. to discuss these changes in more detail. You are all invited to attend and share your thoughts, questions, and concerns. This is just the beginning. Sincerely, Charles Benson, CEO. The send button hovered beneath his cursor, but Charles paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before clicking it. This was it, the start of something new, something necessary. With one final push, he clicked the button, sending the message out to every corner of the company. Now, there was no turning back. The next morning, as Charles stood in the middle of the massive auditorium that would host the town hall meeting, a wave of anxiety washed over him. It wasn't the stage fright he felt, though addressing over 1,000 employees would be daunting. It was the unknown. How would they react? Would they believe him? Could he rebuild their trust after so much damage had been done? One by one, employees began to file in, filling the rows of seats in the sprawling room. The tension was palpable. People exchanged whispers, glanced at each other with cautious curiosity. Charles noticed many faces from different departments. Some he recognized from his time undercover, others who worked in offices he rarely visited. They all wore expressions of quiet anticipation. Behind him, the large projector screen displayed a live feed of the event, streaming it to employees in offices around the world who couldn't attend in person. Every step of this event was designed to foster transparency, something the company had sorely lacked in recent years. At 10 a.m. sharp, the lights dimmed, and Charles took his place behind the podium. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat and began to speak. "I want to start by saying thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for being here, and thank you for your patience. Over the past week, I've had the privilege of seeing this company through a new lens. I've spoken to many of you, listened to your stories, and learned more about what it's like to work here than I ever did from behind my desk." The room remained silent, but Charles could feel the energy shift. People were listening. "I won't pretend that I fully understood the challenges you've been facing until now. I won't pretend that everything can be fixed overnight. But I can promise you this: I'm committed to making things right, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because this company's future depends on it." Charles paused, scanning the room. He could see the skepticism in some of their eyes, but he also saw something else: hope, a small spark of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could change. "I've already begun making some changes," he continued. "First, we are restructuring the way we approach work-life balance. No more unrealistic deadlines, no more 14-hour days just to meet quotas. Your well-being matters. Second, we are overhauling our promotion process. We will be implementing a transparent system where merit and hard work are recognized, regardless of your department or who you know." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was a pain point Charles had heard repeatedly during his time undercover: favoritism, glass ceilings, and a sense that promotions were reserved for a chosen few. Finally, Charles said, his voice growing stronger, "We are creating a direct line of communication between leadership and all employees. Starting today, you will have the opportunity to speak with me or any other member of the executive team directly, whether it's through open office hours or anonymous feedback channels. You will no longer be silenced. Your voices will shape the future of this company." For a moment, the silence stretched out as Charles let his words sink in. Then, slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was tentative at first, but soon others joined in. Within moments, the auditorium was filled with applause, a sound that was more than just polite acknowledgement. It was genuine, a sign that the message had resonated. Charles stepped back from the podium, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This was only the beginning, but it was a promising start. The town hall continued as employees raised their hands, asking questions about the changes, expressing concerns, and offering their thoughts on how the company could improve. Charles answered each question candidly, without the usual corporate spin, determined to be as transparent as possible. By the time the town hall ended, it was clear that the seeds of change had been planted. People were talking, some cautiously optimistic, others still skeptical. But there was an energy in the room that hadn't been there before. The employees had been given a voice, and for the first time in a long time, they were being heard. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Charles threw himself into the task of rebuilding the company's culture from the ground up. He met with department heads, listened to their concerns, and worked with HR to design new policies that would ensure fairness, transparency, and a healthier work environment. One of the first major changes he implemented was a new mentorship program designed to break down the silos that had developed between departments and give junior employees more access to leadership. Charles personally reached out to some of the most promising young talent in the company, inviting them to join the program and offering them guidance that had been sorely lacking in the past. He also made it clear that managers would no longer be rewarded solely based on output. Leadership wasn't just about hitting targets, it was about how they treated their teams, how they fostered growth, and how they built trust. Managers who failed to support their employees or who engaged in favoritism would be held accountable. The changes were met with mixed reactions at first. Some senior executives, particularly those who had thrived under the old system, pushed back. They argued that these changes would slow down the company's growth, that they would make Benson Enterprises less competitive in an industry that demanded speed and efficiency. But Charles stood firm. He knew that short-term profits meant nothing if the company crumbled from within. The hardest part of the transition came when Charles had to make difficult personnel decisions. Several senior leaders, including some he had once considered close allies, were unwilling to adapt to the new culture. They continued to push back, refusing to embrace the values that Charles was trying to reintroduce. Ultimately, they were given a choice: change or leave. Some chose to leave, and as painful as it was to see them go, Charles knew it was necessary. The company couldn't move forward while carrying the weight of old, toxic habits. Weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, the culture at Benson Enterprises began to shift. The changes didn't happen overnight, but the atmosphere in the office was different. People began to smile more, to engage in genuine conversations, to collaborate across departments without fear of stepping on toes. The mentorship program became a cornerstone of the company, fostering innovation and creating new opportunities for employees at all levels. Charles continued to walk the floors regularly, not as a janitor this time, but as a CEO who was determined to stay connected to his people. He spoke with employees, checked in on their progress, and most importantly, listened. The invisible walls that had once separated him from the workforce had crumbled, replaced by a culture of openness and trust. The employees who had been on the verge of leaving started to stay, and the ones who had already left began reaching out, asking if they could return. Benson Enterprises was no longer just a tech company. It was a place where people felt valued, where their work mattered, and where they were seen. One afternoon, as Charles was walking through the R&D department, he noticed Olivia, the brilliant head of the division, standing in front of a whiteboard, animatedly discussing a new project with her team. Gone were the dark circles under her eyes, the weariness that had weighed her down. In its place was the spark of energy and excitement that had made her such a valuable asset to the company in the first place. As Charles passed by, Olivia caught his eye and smiled. A genuine, grateful smile. "Thank you," she mouthed, her eyes filled with appreciation. Charles nodded, feeling a swell of pride. It hadn't been easy, and there was still work to be done, but the company he had built was beginning to heal. The seeds of change had taken root, and Benson Enterprises was finally becoming the place he had always envisioned it could be. A legacy rebuilt. Months had passed since Charles Benson had sent that fateful email, the one that had kick-started the transformation of Benson Enterprises. The changes he had initiated had taken root, and slowly, the company he had once feared was spiraling into toxicity, was finding its way back to the values on which it had been founded. Charles stood at the same floor-to-ceiling windows in his office, gazing out at the bustling city below. This view had always symbolized his success, a constant reminder of how far he had come. But today, as he watched the sun dip behind the towering buildings, casting the city in a golden glow, the view symbolized something more. It wasn't just about his personal achievements anymore. It was about the legacy he would leave behind, not in terms of wealth or status, but in the lives of the people who worked for him, in the culture he had built and then rebuilt. Benson Enterprises had become more than just a tech company. It was now a place where innovation and humanity coexisted, where employees were seen not just as resources to be maximized, but as people with dreams, struggles, and aspirations. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But as Charles looked back on the last few months, he knew the most difficult part was behind him. The morning of the company's annual summit had arrived, an event where all employees came together to celebrate the year's achievements and set the course for the future. This year's summit felt different, though. In years past, it had been a sleek, polished affair, full of PowerPoints, polished presentations, and applause for the executives. But this time, it wasn't about showcasing profits or celebrating the next big tech breakthrough. It was about the people, the lifeblood of Benson Enterprises. The summit was held in a large convention center downtown, and as Charles entered the bustling lobby, he was greeted by faces he hadn't seen in years. Some were employees who had left during the company's darker times, but who had returned now that the culture had shifted. Others were fresh faces, new talent drawn by the company's renewed commitment to fostering a positive and inclusive work environment. Charles made his way through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, and engaging in brief but meaningful conversations. It was during these moments, more than anything else, that he felt the impact of the changes he had made. People no longer avoided eye contact with him out of fear or reverence. They approached him as equals, as colleagues, and some even as friends. One particular interaction stood out to him as he moved through the sea of attendees. A young woman, no older than 25, approached him hesitantly, holding a small notebook. "Mr. Benson," she said quietly, a nervous smile tugging at her lips. Charles turned to her and smiled warmly. "Please, call me Charles." Her face lit up, and she nodded. "Charles," she corrected herself. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've only been with the company for a few months, but I've already noticed how different it feels compared to other places I've worked. People actually care about each other here. It's not just about deadlines or numbers. It feels real." Charles nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I don't know if you've heard about the mentorship program you started, but it's been incredible. I've been working with Olivia from R&D, and it's changed everything for me. I was struggling when I first started, but having someone like her to guide me has made such a difference. I don't think I would have lasted if it weren't for that program." Charles smiled. He had heard about the mentorship program's success, but hearing it directly from the employees it had impacted made it all the more real. "I'm so glad to hear that. Olivia is one of the best, and I'm happy to know the program is making a difference." The woman nodded again, a little more confidently this time. "It is, and I just wanted to let you know that we all appreciate what you've done. I know it couldn't have been easy." Charles smiled, the weight of the past few months feeling a little lighter. "Thank you. It hasn't been easy, but hearing stories like yours makes it all worth it." As the woman moved on, blending back into the crowd, Charles felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had been right to take action when he did. The company was healing, and its people were thriving. But this transformation wasn't just about policies or programs. It was about the small, everyday moments of kindness, mentorship, and support that were now woven into the fabric of the company. Later that afternoon, the summit moved into its main event, the keynote speech. This year, instead of bringing in an outside speaker or having a high-level executive present, Charles had decided to make the keynote a more personal affair. He wanted to speak directly to the employees, from the heart, about where they had been and where they were going. The auditorium was packed, and as Charles stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. He looked out at the crowd, at the familiar faces of employees who had been with the company since its inception, at the new faces full of hope and ambition, and at the leadership team sitting in the front row, their expressions a mix of pride and anticipation. He began his speech not with a prepared script, but with a story about his own journey over the past year. When I first founded Benson Enterprises, Charles began, I had one goal in mind: to create a company that was known for its innovation, for its cutting-edge technology, and for its ability to change the world. And for a long time, I believed we were doing just that. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the most important part of that vision. I forgot about the people who made that innovation possible. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. A few months ago, I decided to do something drastic. I went undercover as a janitor here, walking the halls and working alongside the very people who keep this company running. And what I found shook me to my core. I saw employees who felt overworked, undervalued, and invisible. I realized that the culture we had built was no longer one of collaboration and support. It was one of competition and burnout. The room was silent, every eye focused on him. Charles could feel the weight of their attention, but he also sensed something else: understanding. Many of them had experienced those same struggles, and his words were a recognition of the challenges they had faced. But Charles said, his voice stronger now, we made a decision to change. Together, we began to rebuild Benson Enterprises into a place where people are seen, where your voices matter, and where your contributions are recognized. We still have work to do, but I can tell you this: the future of this company looks brighter than ever because of you, each and every one of you. A wave of applause broke out, filling the room with a sense of unity and hope. Charles waited until the noise subsided before delivering his final words. I've learned something over the past few months, something I wish I had known from the start. Success isn't just about the bottom line. It's about the people you bring along with you. It's about the relationships you build, the lives you impact, and the legacy you leave behind. And that's the kind of success we're building here at Benson Enterprises. The applause this time was louder, more sustained. It wasn't the polite clapping of employees at a corporate event. It was real, full of emotion and gratitude. Charles felt a lump rise in his throat, but he pushed it down, smiling as he stepped back from the podium. He had done what he came to do. As the summit ended and the employees began to filter out, Charles remained on stage for a few moments, watching as people hugged, laughed, and shared in the excitement of the day. His leadership team approached him, their faces filled with pride. Marcus, his COO, extended his hand. You did it, Charles. You turned this place around. Charles shook his hand, but his smile was modest. We did it, he corrected. This wasn't just me. It was all of us. Jessica, the head of HR, stepped forward. I'll be honest, I didn't think we'd get here. But seeing the way people have responded, it's incredible. Linda, who had been the most skeptical of the changes in the beginning, nodded in agreement. I'll admit I had my doubts, but this feels right. Charles looked at them all, his heart swelling with pride. This was what leadership was supposed to feel like, not just overseeing profits and growth, but guiding people through change, lifting them up, and creating a space where they could thrive. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the convention center, Charles felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, full of setbacks and challenges, but it had been worth it. Benson Enterprises was no longer just a company. It was a community, a place where people could dream, innovate, and build a future together. And that was the legacy Charles Benson had always hoped to leave.